Hi, I'm Lizzie Harewood and welcome to Affinity Talks Gospel podcast.
Hello there, and I'm Graham Nichols, and we are really pleased that we've got another special guest today, and it's Julie Maxwell from Lovewise and other things she's involved with. Welcome, Julie.
Hello, good to be with you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself, anything that may be of interest biographically.
Okay, so I live in Hampshire. I am a community paediatrician, which means that I am a doctor and I look after children with various learning difficulties, ADHD, autism, language disorders, that kind of thing, and also sort of mental health problems. I have 3 grown-up children. I've been married for nearly 27 years to my husband, Alistair.
I was going to ask a question about a paediatrician for a sec, which is a paediatrician any generic sort of children's doctor, or does a paediatrician always specialize in something paediatrician-wise?
So a paediatrician is a doctor that looks after children. So that could be anything from newborn babies all the way through to, almost adults, sometimes even to adolescents. But I specialised when I had my children so that I could work part-time and stay near home. And I specialised in community paediatrics, which basically means that it's been kind of a 9-to-5 flexible job that I can easily fit round doing part-time, being with my children and doing various stuff at church.
Well, although you mentioned ADHD and various other things, presumably you in your job may have or still do see people who've got, I don't know, broken legs or need ear grommets or, loads of other conditions.
I personally haven't done that for about 20 years, but obviously colleagues do, yes, all sorts of illnesses, broken legs, you name it, they see it.
Church-wise, what did you get into that found your way to Lovewise? Because that's your kind of connection with us, is through Lovewise, really.
Yeah, so the way I got into Lovewise was about 13 or 14 years ago. I was a school governor. So I was a school governor for about 15 years altogether. And I discovered as part of that what my children were going to be learning in sex education. And as a result, I was quite horrified about the graphic nature of some of the material, but actually also almost more importantly than that, the lack of teaching on marriage. And in my job as a paediatrician, what I see all the time is lots and lots of children whose difficulties are sometimes caused by, sometimes made worse by family breakdown. So I was quite kind of concerned to hear that they weren't talking about marriage at all, or not in a decent context, despite the fact that's what children needed. So I kind of did a bit of research. I came across Lovewise, which was set up by 2 paediatricians for exactly those reasons. So I was immediately drawn to it and used the material to teach my own children, and then gradually started teaching it in other schools and getting more and more involved with Lovewise.
So Julie, this is quite interesting because you were mentioning earlier that your children are now grown up.
Yeah.
And obviously, and we'll get onto this in more detail a bit later, obviously over recent years there's been a bit of a furore in the press and online, but also in Parliament, about the nature of sex education and materials. But you're saying that this has been going on, some of these materials have been kind of embedded in the system for a lot longer.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, when I first sort of started making some noises about it, there were not very many people making noises about it. There were a few, and there were a few books which kind of traced kind of how we'd got to where we were in the whole sex education realm, even back then. But I was quite frustrated that even a lot of my Christian friends thought I was making a fuss. They kind of thought it wasn't really a big problem, and that they thought I was a bit mad for pulling my kids out of sex education at school. So that was very frustrating. And so actually it's great to see that it is now quite mainstream. And so the sort of the things that have been coming out, particularly in the kind of secular world, are exactly the things that I was kind of banging on about 13 years ago. But it seems to me it's the gender stuff that I think has tipped people over. When parents started realising what their children were being taught about gender, they then started looking at some of the other stuff and realised that it wasn't just the gender that was the problem. There was a lot more stuff that was really, really inappropriate.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably worth saying I'm probably a generation, I've got to be honest, above you guys, or at least half a generation above one of you. I've got adult children, and who are well into adulthood. What was I going to say? When I was having sex education at school, and then I happened to do an apprenticeship, I left school when I was 16, and there was weirdly sex education on this kind of engineering apprenticeship I was on. But even then, which was a long time ago, it would have been late 70s, early 80s. There was nothing about morality. It was entirely, at that time, it was mainly about contraception and sexually transmitted diseases. That was the focus, but there was nothing about morality even then. So this is a long time ago, 40 years ago or something. So in a sense, the rot set in. But as you say, but particular issues to do with sexual ethics have perhaps come to the fore. Just come back on the family so it doesn't get lost. Not your family, the family issue about teaching about the good of families. I was really interested that there was an interview with Tony Sewell recently, because he's got a book coming out about it's got a title something to do with Black people prospering, or Black success, I think it's called, something like that. And he makes the point, he has different solutions, but he makes the point that a lot of poorer performance by Afro-Caribbean or African families in England is to do with the breakdown of family and the lack of fathers. His solution is to say we need to support single parents better, as opposed to we need. But it's interesting that is a very well established statistic about breakdown. But yeah, you mentioned family. There's obviously sexuality as well, but the breakdown in family kind of comes back to my generation of being educated to say that there's nothing really special about families.
It's interesting. I think, and I'm sure, again, Julie and I have quite a lot of crossover in our work, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, but there is, within the guidance on relationships and sex education, all children are now required to be taught about the importance of marriage and of the family unit, and not just a family unit. I mean, obviously we have to educate about different types of family, but the importance of marriage is distinctly something that teachers should be teaching about for the benefit of family and society. I don't necessarily think that happens in practice.
No.
But it is there in black and white.
Yes.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of other stuff that has been interpreted in different ways that has then snowballed and created a bit of a toxic environment for all kinds of ideologies.
What is the point of Lovewise, before we then get on to a more general discussion about what's happening? What's Lovewise for?
Yeah, so as I said, Lovewise, it was set up by two paediatricians and a head teacher as well, secondary head teacher. So the purpose of Lovewise is to produce resources for schools, churches, parents, youth leaders on relationships, marriage, sex, and also on sort of wise living generally. So we often put it in the context of making good choices in generally life. So it's not just focused on sex and relationships, but just kind of as children grow up, they have to start making wise choices. But what it is kind of helping to try and teach children is about sort of God's design for marriage, and also some of the statistics and things that back up that actually it's not just that God says it's good, but it actually the statistics that we see in society, a bit like you were saying about Tony Sewell's book. And I've just been reading Brad Wilcox's book, Get Married, which again has lots of really, really interesting statistics about the privilege that being brought up in a married, stable household brings. And then we sort of look at the wisdom and the benefits of saving sex for marriage, because obviously that how you conduct your relationships prior to marriage and prior to kind of being an adult has a huge bearing on how successful your relationships are in the future. So a lot of the sort of sex education teaching now might talk about marriage, but it also makes no kind of judgments about how young people live their lives now. So by the time they get to the age of wanting to get married, they might have had serial relationships, many of which might have been sexual as well. So it's sort of putting it all into that kind of context, giving statistics, and but also giving guidance about how they can make good choices, really, all from a sort of biblical perspective, but with practical outworkings and statistics to go behind it as well.
So who are these resources intended for, Julie? Are they for families, for parents to be used within the home, or are they intended for use in wider context?
So we have a variety of different things. So we have some books called Growing Up God's Way for boys and girls, which are sort of pink and blue books. Maybe kind of gender stereotypical, I suppose, but that's kind of what they are. And those books are designed for parents to share with their pre-pubertal children or children going through puberty. So from sort of 8, 9, something like that, to share them with their children. So that goes through puberty, growing up, what marriage is, how babies are made, in a very kind of gentle way, with some nice sort of line drawings, cartoon type drawings, all from a very biblical perspective. And then the child can have that book on their bookcase. So my kids had them on their bookcase for a long time now. I've got some very dog-eared versions of it. So those are really good for parents. We also have a sort of a PowerPoint type presentation that can be used by parents with their children. Actually, what I use that for is I do that with a group of 10 and 11-year-olds at our church every year. So I sort of offer it as a sort of 2-hour session, and it goes through similar material to the Growing Up God's Way books, which I then encourage the parents to buy. So the parents talk about it with the children at home as well. And then we also have a book for parents called Challenges to Living God's Way, which is sort of for older teenagers, 14 to 18, which looks at some of the tricky topics that they have to deal with: homosexuality, pornography, masturbation, cohabiting, various things like that. So those are some of the things we have for parents. We also have resources for schools. So we have a number of online resources which schools can access for free. So there's one called Relationships Matter, which is for primary schools, which covers the relationships curriculum. And then there's several secondary school materials. So Marriage, Sex and Living Wisely, which looks at what marriage is, why you might like to think about saving sex for marriage. And then a very popular one called Pornography, Dangers and Decisions, which goes through some of the potential harms of pornography to hopefully enable young people to make good decisions going forward. And I think what I'm hoping to do is to kind of have some maybe more versatile resources on our website, so that people can pick and choose a little bit, sort of videos, Bible studies, articles. So we also have a website called Lovewise Online, which is for teenagers, which has lots and lots of short articles that we update on a monthly or every couple of weeks, put a new article on that might be there was one about the Barbie movie, there was one about Valentine's Day and singleness, one about New Year, making a fresh start, things like marriage. So there's lots of stuff that we try and produce to help people.
It sounds really good. By the way, one of the founders, started life here in my hometown in Haywards Heath. One of the paediatricians you mentioned. So her dad was an elder in a church locally. And we've used the material locally in schools, and my kids have actually used the material with their kids. A little bit excruciating at times with the various questions, but really found it helpful. So it's great material. My question would be, how do you get it out there? Because it sounds really good. And I'm thinking, this is like the kind of Christian Stonewall in terms of the sort of, resources they're producing. Obviously they do other campaigning as well, but it's how you get out there. Sorry, just to kind of context it a bit more. My daughter and daughter-in-law started going to the library recently they've got kids who are preschool. And so, great idea. Let's go to rhyme time and everything else. I think they found probably 1 in 4 books had a particular sexuality agenda. And they were with outrage kind of sending us photos of them on the kind of family WhatsApp. That's a pretty strong force to try and contend with by saying, well, here's some other materials you could have in the library. So how are you getting it out there? Obviously, you haven't got the funding of Stonewall yet.
No, and not likely to, is the reality. Word of mouth. I mean, our books are available. So 10 of those, Good Book Company, Amazon, all the usual outlets sell them. So the books are what sell really, really well. And they also sell really well in the States. And a number of our books have also been translated into various different languages as well, which is exciting. So I think there are lots of people who probably have got the Growing Up God's Way books, but don't actually realise that they come from Lovewise. So often when I talk about Lovewise, I'll say, oh yeah, the Growing Up God's Way books. They go, oh yes, I've got those. So people don't necessarily realise that we have got other stuff, because some of our other resources are only available from our website. So yeah, I mean, it's a matter of getting out there, but also not attracting the sort of the wrong kind of interest, I suppose, because what we don't want is for people to be saying our stuff is terrible, which I think so. It wouldn't be. It's not that easy to kind of promote it necessarily to the right people who would be interested in it, if that makes sense.
I'm interested, Julie, about how schools respond when you bring. I know that you will often, or maybe perhaps slightly less frequently now, you're going to schools and you'll give presentations, a bit like all the outside agencies that would come in and deliver sessions on, sexuality or safe sex, etc., that have been publicised recently, would come and bring their own sort of ideologies. And many schools have been, completely okay with this. How do they respond to you as an explicitly Christian organisation teaching about the importance of marriage, about the nature of marriage, its importance for family life, and potentially giving pointing towards saving sex for that kind of relationship?
Yeah, it is tricky. And so going back before COVID, or a bit before that, at one point I was going into about six local schools in my local area. I'm now down to one for various reasons. So some of that is just post-COVID, and also post some of the furore about outside agencies. So I think schools are just more wary of outside agencies than they probably were in the past. But also I was in a number of schools where Church of England schools where they then decided that teaching about marriage from a biblical perspective was not okay. And so therefore I wasn't allowed back into those schools, which is interesting. So the one school I still going to regularly is a Catholic school where it's completely acceptable to give a biblical version of talking about marriage, saving sex for marriage. Other schools, that is harder. I mean, interestingly, I've never had negative reactions from pupils. So pupils, whether it be primary schools, where I go in to teach about puberty, marriage, how babies are made, or secondary school pupils, where you're talking about what marriage is, what might be the benefits of saving sex for marriage. They're very willing to discuss it. They kind of come out with their thoughts, and also talking about pornography as well. They can usually give me all the potential dangers of pornography. They can tell me the answers. And again, talking about marriage and saving sex for marriage, again, they can give me all the positives and all the negatives. I often don't even need to say it. Sometimes it's the teachers that because it's an uncomfortable message for them sometimes, because they might be living lives that are different to that. I remember having a conversation with some parents one year, and they said, we're single parents. We don't want our children to feel bad about having single parents. And I said, of course, we're not going to do that. And then they both said, but we really want our children to have a different experience. We really want our children to get married and to have successful marriages. They weren't Christians. So, we need to kind of get past the sort of being afraid to upset the grown-ups, because and that we're not protecting the children because we're too afraid to upset the grown-ups, and we need to get back to protecting the children, don't we, really, in so many ways, not just in the areas of sexuality. I think
I think you're right, and I think that's a narrative that has kind of been overtaken by other competing rights, and often I think it's the uncomfortableness of adults that seems to get in the way of actually thinking what might be the best for a child or to safeguard a child. Creation, absolutely, Julie.
Yeah. How can people access the materials? Obviously, they can buy the books. You mentioned where we can get the books, but other than that, what's your website? You mentioned a particular website. Was that a youth geared one, and you have another one, as it were?
Yeah, so we have our main website, which is Lovewise. I'm sure we can make sure the website address is available with. So that's our main website. So all of our resources are you can buy them on from the website directly. The one for youth is called Lovewise Online, and that is just a website with lots and lots of articles. All kind of you can search for whatever article you want. We're on social media as well. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, not TikTok yet, but
right. And yeah, I mean, just to say, my experience here locally is the same of being shut out of some schools that we were previously allowed into, but it's not always explicit, is it? It's not always kind of we don't like Christians, and you should. Sometimes it is just mysterious. You're no longer invited back, and you think, well, nothing's changed in the curriculum. I wonder who's fulfilling that part now. So it's a challenge, but we keep going and we keep praying and looking for openings. Just broadening it out a little bit. Sorry, Lizzie, did you want to say something different?
No, I was going to also seek to broaden it out a little bit, because obviously Julie and we meet reasonably regularly to discuss things of this. And I was just wondering if Julie could give our listeners, perhaps parents or grandparents or even teachers, a bit of an overview of what's going on with some of the materials that are in schools or have been in schools that have garnered so much attention, and what the government has been doing about that, and how as Christians we can pray and act in response to those things.
Yes, I mean, I think it's all kind of come to a bit more of a kind of general attention, I think, hasn't it? So there were 2 reports which came out. Was it last year? I lose track of time. Was it last year?
Yes.
So Miriam Cates' report. I can't remember what it's called now.
The new Social Covenant report.
Yes. That was called, something about schools. And then there was Asleep at the Wheel, which was Lottie Moore's report particularly on kind of gender. And those 2 reports are worth a look at if you can bear it, because it gives you a good idea of some of the really awful stuff that is in schools. And often, I think, unbeknown to parents. So parents often, even when they've asked what material is going to be, they're not always allowed to see it or not always shown it beforehand. So I think it is really good that it has kind of come to public knowledge, and so there is currently a review undergoing, as far which we were supposed to have had sort of an update of the RSE guidance by now, and that hasn't occurred, which presumably is because they can't agree. I imagine it seems to be how things work. But I mean, before Christmas, we had the draft guidance on gender and gender questioning in schools, which I think is being quite a key thing, which helps us kind of to think about how to address gender, which you might think has nothing to do with this, but it's all very much part and parcel of the same thing. Because if you're teaching a sex education, you have to be able to teach about biological sex and the difference between men and women, and how that plays out for relationships and how babies are made. So I think we need to really pray, particularly for MPs like Miriam Cates, Nick Fletcher, who are speaking out about some of the really harmful stuff in schools. And
without wanting to sensationalize, Julie, because I often get people that aren't in the know saying things like, but this isn't really happening, or it's not really as bad as you think. Even Christians who perhaps, aren't really, or perhaps their experience with their children's school hasn't been particularly worrying. what could you tell us about what is happening?
Yeah, I think people are worried that the stuff that gets in the newspapers, so the stuff that, I mean, an example was the dice, the Proud Trust dice, where they sort of made two dice, whatever you say, and on each side of the dice had a body part or object or something, and the idea was that the teenagers threw the dice, and then whichever two things turned up, they talked about what you might be able to do sexually between those two things. And I mean, there are plenty of even more horrific things than that are being talked about in schools. But that I think is a very, but there are lots of schools using that stuff. And, and I get people, and I'm sure you do as well, Lizzie, parents and teachers coming to me all of the time saying, my school is using this, my school is using this, my child came home saying this. So, what is in the news is not just sensational, even if it might be in the Daily Mail, and you might think, well, do I believe that? It is true. It is true. And I've had lots of parents coming to me saying that. And I think there's just plenty of parents. This stuff is going on in their kids' schools, but they don't know about it because your kids don't always tell you what they're being taught at school. But when you have children coming home saying, we got told today that we could choose whether a boy or a girl, am I going to turn into a boy tomorrow, mummy? It's that kind of thing. Then you find out what they've been taught when they come home and hear that.
In terms of the engagement with that, so let's assume it's bad from all that you've said. What's the best way church leaders and Christian parents and grandparents and aunties and uncles can engage with that bad situation?
So, I mean, I think there's two ways. One is to try and do what you can in schools, which is how I got started on this and didn't get very far. So, is to ask questions, ask what's being taught, ask what books are in the library. I think that's a crucial thing. So like you were saying, Graham, about the books in the public library, these books are in primary school libraries, secondary school. I mean, some horrific stuff in school libraries.
Yeah.
So ask what books are in the libraries. Ask what they're being taught, ask to view the material. So there's, various programs for PSHE, RSE that, have some good stuff in them, but also some awful stuff, which some schools might not use, but, ask, find out what is being taught, ask those questions, not in a negative way, not in a combative way, just in an interested way. And then if you find out concerning stuff, then you can work out what to deal with it. But start off being supportive, just being interested. No school can be annoyed at you, hopefully, for not being interested. So I think it's that tack. The other tack is to be protecting our children. So as Christian parents, grandparents, youth leaders, church leaders, we need to be absolutely convinced that God's ways are good. So God's ways for marriage, sexuality, gender, etc., are good. So we need to believe it ourselves that it's good. We need to live it, demonstrate good friendships, good relationships, good marriages. We need to strengthen our own marriages. We need to welcome single parents to, if we've got stable marriages, welcome single parents and their children so that they can experience stable marriages. We need to live it, and then we need to teach it. So from a young age, we need to be teaching, correct biology, correct terminology, age appropriate, obviously, but teaching about marriage, teaching biblically, and then as they get older, kind of, addressing the difficult issues that come up, and using the opportunities, making sure we know what else kids are being exposed to. So that might mean watching films and reading books that you probably might not want to watch or read, so that you know what kids are being bombarded with. And then, of course, there's social media, and curating what children. I mean, that's another big thing that's kind of coming out in the press at the moment, is the idea of trying to ban mobile phones and ban, social media for young children.
So it's not just parents and grandparents that you work with. Obviously, you also create resources for schools. And I wonder if I'm allowed to monopolise on this opportunity here as well. Because obviously, in my role at the Association of Christian Teachers, we talk to many teachers who perhaps don't feel that they have that liberty to kind of raise their head above the parapet, And what would you suggest? I mean, I'm actually now just going to ask you to recommend they get in touch with the Association of Christian Teachers. But what else can teachers do if they feel that they are being tasked with teaching something that's unscientific, or really ask questions of their conscience and their Christian understanding of marriage, of gender, of sexuality?
I mean, I think it's really tough, isn't it? It is really, really tough. But I think even teachers can start off with questioning, because my experience is that some of this stuff, once the schools are questioned, it transpires they haven't really thought it through.
Yeah.
And that somewhere along the line, somebody's just thought, oh, this looks like a good program of work, and they've just gone with it, and they haven't thought through. And so I think just stopping them and kind of saying, just think about what you're teaching here. I think sometimes that can be enough, unless you've got a real activist teacher in the school, that's a different kettle of fish. But I think, there are a significant number of schools where they're just teaching some of this stuff because they're young, they haven't got their own children, they haven't thought it through, or they are older and kind of just think this is how society is now, and just haven't thought through the implications for children of teaching this stuff, and of not teaching about marriage and stable relationships and saving sex for marriage.
Presumably, between your two organisations, Association of Christian Teachers, Lovewise, there are some materials kind of that might help, I don't know, school governors as well as teachers about what the legal framework should be. Because I would imagine if I went to a governor's meeting tomorrow, I've got a theological background, but I don't actually know off the top of my head what are the obligations of schools in terms of what Lizzie said earlier about marriage and so on needing to be included. So presumably there's briefing documents on your websites, or if people get hold of you that would help in those contexts.
So at ACT, we seek to compile lots of really helpful documents. Some are very for use in schools. For example, Lovewise resources. And we also have a section on our website that is all to do with the kind of statutory frameworks. And I would say that people like the Christian Institute have provided the most helpful resources there that give you that explanation of the framework and explain where your roles and responsibilities fit into that, and where perhaps you're allowed to push and express a desire for more freedom of your conscience. So yeah, we provide quite helpful signposts to those.
So you're kind of an aggregator of lots of.
Absolutely. I say, why replicate something if something better is already in existence? And I just don't have time.
Yeah. I was going to say, Christian Institute, also Christian Concern as well. Also have, John Denning at Christian Institute, Steve Beager at Christian Concern, both really helpful, very knowledgeable people of the legal stuff. And like you say, Lizzie, we do what we do, and if people have already done stuff, we just point them in the right direction.
Just to broaden it out again a little bit, or just to finish off the protect point, I love the idea of really simple headings that I can sort of write down and remember: ask and protect. But under the protect one, I heard the modelling and the teaching and understanding what's going on and so on. You didn't say much about protect in the sense of exclude. Pull them out of a film, pull them away from a device, pull them out of teaching. Do we need to protect sometimes by just not letting children go somewhere, be somewhere, learn something?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I think from the perspective of schools, I think that is very, very difficult. So when my kids were this age, sex education was, very defined lessons. In primary school, it would be 1 or 2 lessons at the end of the summer term in year 6. And then, secondary school, they would have kind of relationships day or whatever. So it was very defined. It was relatively easy to pull them out. And as I discovered, lots of other parents did the same. And I felt personally that as a Christian, people say to me, oh, they'll feel different, they'll feel awkward. Well, as Christians, we're supposed to be different. We need to be teaching our children to be different. However, the situation now is that this stuff is, relationships education. You cannot withdraw your child from. And most of this stuff happens in relationships education, not sex education. I mean, what even is sex education? Actually, it's a very tiny, tiny bit, because most of this is biology or relationships education, actually. So, and also the other issue is that, a lot of this stuff is throughout the curriculum. So there's lots of stuff you can see online about embedding this stuff. So you've got English lessons that will be about a gay person, or maths lessons that will be about somebody who was transgender, and a famous mathematician, or so it's being kind of put throughout the curriculum. So it is really, really hard. So increasing numbers of people are actually electing to home educate, which is always an option. But I think certainly at home, we can be careful what films they watch. We can put limits on social media, and or stop them from going on it at all. Put filters on devices. And there are all sorts of things we can do. But I think often as parents, we can be afraid to upset our children. So I think we need to get back to being parents and parenting our children.
Yeah,
I think that's a great point. And I also think that as Christian parents, we have this great privilege that we can redress and tell our children the truth, that we can seek to undo faulty teaching, and where we can protect them. My concern is for those children that don't have that level of protection. And although I think there is a place for withdrawing, I think there's also a place that Christians need to be. I don't mean get involved in a culture war, but I do mean they need to use the democratic means they have to try and protect a generation of young people who are getting fed lies, and ultimately lies that will damage.
Absolutely. So I think, become school governors. So if your children are at school, become a school governor, and then you can, have some influence. I think we just need to do what we can for society as well as for our own children. Yeah, I mean, if I got what I wanted when my kids were 10, 11, I'd have left it there. And I would have sorted my kids' school out for the time being. But, I wouldn't have found Lovewise and done all the things that I've got involved in.
Do you ever, Lizzie, think about home educating your children when they get to secondary age?
Would I?
Yes.
Just
out of interest. Is that a tricky question?
It wouldn't. I mean, I probably wouldn't want to. In that, I don't necessarily think for my children that would be the best thing. However, I would have to reassess. I'd have to reassess what was going on in school at that point. I'd probably try other strategies first. I'd probably do my very best to engage positively with the school if I felt there was a particular reason that I'd want to take them out. However, I would never discount it, but it certainly wouldn't be my natural inclination. I'm a supporter of mainstream education in general. And I think where possible, you need to do all you can to get in there and work within the system. You also need those that are the dissenters and that will work outside the system.
Yeah.
And I feel very strongly that I am called, my husband, who I made become a school governor. I believe that we've got that role at the moment. And at some point, if I had to, I would reassess, but I would do my very best to work from the inside first.
Yeah. Sorry to spring that question on you.
No, it's all right. I wouldn't be able to teach a maths lesson. So that would probably discount for that reason.
My impression talking to quite a lot of people is that it's more on the agenda than it ever was. For most of my time in Christian ministry, it was a very sort of marginalized specialist thing that some families did, and they were a little bit unusual. And now, although not many people in, say, our church and lots of other churches are doing it, loads more people are talking about it and saying, I'm really tempted. I just can't logistically manage it. But if I could, I would. So that, it's a significant change.
And I think it's become more common, not just among Christians as well. I think with all of the sort of the RSE stuff, and I think COVID, where kids were forced to be kind of effectively home educated for all that time. I think there are a lot of parents who've just kind of thought, wow, actually, do you know what? I'm just going to do this myself.
Yeah, it's sometimes easier at a practical level, sometimes, because you don't have to get them to school and be accountable for being there at certain hours, and you can work it around your work and all those things. But they're not really good reasons. But
no,
that's how it goes. Just kind of broadly as we draw things to a close, the influences on children and I guess the Ask and Protect covers all of those as well. But anything that you're observing in terms of cultural influences on children outside of education?
I mean, oh gosh, I mean that's a huge question, isn't it? I mean, I think the whole kind of cultural thing in society is tricky for children, isn't it? So, this whole identity thing, kind of wanting to, children be told that they need to be themselves and that they can be whoever they want to be, which kind of contradict each other to a certain extent. So, and so that's quite huge. That's a big pressure on children and young people, isn't it? Sort of trying to find themselves and to be their best selves and kind of thinking that if life is tough, that somehow they're not being their best selves. So I think, and that obviously plays into the whole kind of sexuality and gender thing as well, but, because that is the sort of identity that often they, kind of pick on. So I think, and I think the whole social media thing, as I was saying this to somebody the other day, when us three go on social media, we see certain things, and the three of us probably see very similar things on social media. Our kids will go on the same social media and they will see completely different things.
Yeah.
So it's almost like kind of alternate realities, as it were, in that they are seeing almost like a completely different reality. I mean, I don't know if you've watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and because I think that kind of shows it really quite well, that, the whole algorithm thing, that when it feels like we're talking a different language to our children, it is because we really, really are, that because they are kind of seeing a whole different reality. And I think that's what we need to be aware of. And we need to be kind of working out how we engage with that and how we speak into that, because otherwise we're sort of talking at cross purposes all the time, because we're talking about what we know as fact. They kind of have a whole different raft of what they think is fact. And unless we know what they're thinking and what they're being told is fact, we can't then argue it. Argue is the wrong word, but if they kind of throw some kind of statistic or some kind of fact at us and we're like, oh right, okay, is that true? But if we know that it's not true and we're able to say, well, actually, have you thought about this? Then, that enables us to engage with it rather than just kind of thinking, oh my goodness, is that just something I don't know? And it might be, or it might just be that it's not really actually true.
Yeah, it's about how not just children, but young adults consume news has changed dramatically. And talking to millennials as well, actually, about how they consume news is quite different to how I did and do. And here's a fun thing with some of my grandchildren. Now I'm encouraging them to go on computer games. Whereas with my children, I was encouraging them not to go on computer games because I'd rather they went on computer games than went on social media. So, there are some. Obviously, I'm not encouraging them to go on computer games for hours and become totally antisocial. But I'm very relaxed about them because actually, I think in terms of brain development and so forth, a limited amount of computer gaming is actually very helpful. Whereas social media, I think, is known to be damaging. I wonder when
you just have to be concerned about who they're playing with.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I am, and my children who have children are concerned. And there's certain online game things that they won't let them go on, even though the games seemed completely innocent. There's a number of platforms which are used for grooming and all sorts of things. Where the games are not violent or sexually explicit or anything, but they're quite tame. But the forums that go with them are not good. So parents absolutely need to be discerning about that. Positively, we do have a better story in terms of who we are and how we live. We do have prayer. We have God on the throne that we can pray to. So I want people to kind of end, if they've made their way all to the end of this, they're not too depressed about all these wars going on, because we got a better story and because God's in charge. There can be little victories, but there can be overall victories. And I love what you said, Lizzie, about not being complacent, but being confident that we can probably deal with our own children reasonably well as parents. But it's the love for other children, which is partly why we engage. It's not just to protect in the sense of trying to kind of put a fence around our own children and stop them anything bad coming in and feeling all right about it. But it's actually a loving thing to engage carefully, but sometimes to confront things that are happening.
Yeah.
Good. Well, we'll end on a note of agreement. Thank you very much, but particularly to you, Julie.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Thank you so much for listening to Affinity Talks Gospel podcast. Affinity is a network of evangelical churches and Christian organizations working together, sharing stories in order to encourage and equip God's people to preach and live the gospel in this generation. If you're interested in supporting this ministry, we'd love you to join us. Just head over to affinity.org.uk/join to find out more. And we look forward to catching up with you on the next episode of Affinity Talks Gospel.